Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and I honestly did not expect to do a second all-one genre episode in a row here, but it allows me to knock a bunch out of my personal backlog and somehow stay relatively timely, even as I expect some of these opinions to be really damn contentious, so here we go. All hip-hop this week. Let's get on the pulse. So we got 7 albums on the docket. Let's first go way back and talk about from Bruiser Wolf, Dope Game Stupid.
I treat my dogs better than white people do theirs. I'm in the drop like a tear. But the engine sounds like a pickup. My roof can't do a sit-up. These hoes come out of nowhere like they hiccups.
So this is a project I actually heard about on Bandcamp months ago, and I really wanted to cover it, only to discover that the full lyrics are barely posted anywhere, which was extremely annoying. And for covering this Detroit MC, you kind of want to have the lyrics in front of you, not just because of his slightly weird, lilting, higher-pitched delivery and a lot of his ad-libs, but also because this is some of the funniest rap music I have heard all damn year. And it's kind of odd. While I think Bruiser Wolf would absolutely kill in a stand-up environment, just in terms of how he can string together some insanely clever, fast-paced punchlines, I wouldn't really call this comedy rap per se. He reminds me a little bit of Ludacris, or especially E40, in being a street rapper who can be legit kind of intimidating on a song like Whip Test, but is also just naturally really funny without forcing it. Full disclosure, I am a big fan of this sort of approach to rap music, especially given that he's a part of Danny Brown's crew, and he's got some pretty good taste in sample-driven, textured production as well. Also, Danny Brown's verse on I'm an Instrument, pretty hilarious as well. Really like that song. And thus, it's incredibly easy music for me to like, but even despite the album's pretty brisk pace, it's hard to ignore how it can feel paradoxically lacking in compositional structure, but also a little bit one-dimensional. I think part of it is how the album can feel a bit short on hooks or punchier choruses, but for as colorful as the punchlines are, I kind of found myself wishing that Bruiser Wolf could expand his lyrical and melodic cadence and humor into some longer stories beyond some pretty expected gangsta posturing, coke dealing, stealing your girl cliches, and a lot of great sports references that made me chuckle every single time. Hell, when he closes off the album with a slightly more serious cut, Momma was a Dopefiend, which flips things down to the street level and gets a little bit more introspective about him growing up in that environment, it adds a lot of humanity. I just think a little bit more structure would help more of these songs stand out beyond just the nuggets of wit that are sprinkled all over the place. But again, as a debut project, mixtape, album, whatever, there's just so much promise that I gotta recommend this regardless. Solid 7 out of 10. Lot of fun. Next up from Ka, A Martyr's Reward.
Some sung bars to become stars. I did it to stop starving. How they done this was fungus, hung us, none of us got part. If action wasn't basking the scoop, we was you foul robbing.
I'm always left feeling that reviewing Ka's music should be easier than it is. His reserved, New York, gravelly voice gangsta maturity against textured, sample-rich production, where the references are a little bit more cerebral but grounded in entrenched historical iconography, it's consistent to a fault. I'm often left feeling that if you've heard a Ka album, you know exactly what to expect. High quality, but only minor stylistic variations, and yes, this album is in that territory, but it feels like Ka was aiming to make this feel a little bit more personal and immediate this time. His delivery is sharper and gruffer, the tempos are a little bit faster, there's actually some drums here, and while he doesn't typically focus on hooks or groove, simply the inclusion of more defined percussion against the slightly cleaner instrumentals I'd say makes this a little bit more accessible. But what I find more interesting is how Ka is as plain-spoken as he'll ever be, where his rigid moralism, the desperate struggle of his past, and proximity to street-level violence they were coaxed through metaphors and symbolism on previous albums, here he feels less of a need for that. His integrity and relentless drive, it's self-evident, and more than ever he's speaking against the systems that would steal from black culture while utilizing police to oppress his people. And while he's managed to sacrifice to find success hand over fist while shunning the easy cash, and then taking the public eye for the people in order to showcase a feasible path to success that those corrupt systems will then try to slander him, at what cost was it attained in a brutal world such as this, especially with so many who fell along the way who weren't as lucky? He prefers scholarship to martyrdom, but given his past, might as well claim the rewards of all of it, even if he has to spend his whole life recovering from that ordeal. Now, all that being said, as much as I do like this a lot, and I think it's actually a pretty solid jump-on point for Cause material, it's kind of hard for me to escape how a lot of his command of symbolism and abstraction add a level of intricate potency that I'm not sure he brings enough urgency or punch to or wish to actually compensate, especially as a lot of his content and themes overlap album to album. And while I still have some reservations how much this will stand out in his catalog as a result of all this, I still enjoyed it a decent bit, so extremely light 8 out of 10. I am a sucker for the catchier moments. He's still insanely smart and witty, but I'd like to see Koss switch things up just a little bit, or really surprise me. Either or. Next up from Uncommon NASA, Only Child.
Shine like it always do. Studio doors locked, nothing more for me to do. So I flipped through CDs I didn't own. Descriptive tones poured out the speaker box. Running water in the background, what's that sound.
Why does it feel like I'm the only person who's looking to talk about this album? Yeah, I didn't love Uncommon NASA's last couple of projects, but given how much popularity we're now seeing for left-field, sample-driven New York hip-hop, you would think NASA would be getting at least a little bit more attention, especially as I would argue this is some of his best work since 2017's Written at Night, one of the best albums of that year. Now, to place this in context with his pretty varied catalog, it's taking some of the cleaner, sharper textures and song construction from City of School, along with some of the more autobiographical themes and his more forceful delivery, which has been a welcome addition to his arsenal in the past couple of years. But there's also more refinement and production balance this time around, while still maintaining that sense of New York grime that crackles through the samples and the slower grooves. What I find more interesting is that some of NASA's other interests are openly influencing his sound now beyond the rugged, left-field underground textures. Especially on the back half of this project, his surrealist bent and the warping vocal filters, they complement his abstract but very focused lyricism, and especially on cuts like Vincent Crane, referencing the organist behind The Crazy World of Arthur Brown and Atomic Rooster in the 70s, and frankly, any of the synth lines on the back half of this album, his interest in vintage progressive rock, it's also seeping through, and that's a compliment. And more than ever, I'm reminded of my personal favorite in his catalog, 2015's Halfway, where the context of time and Uncommon NASA reckoning with his placement within it feels like the thematic core. The past he can never quite revisit, but he can recontextualize. A complex relationship with his father, of which he's only now starting to fully connect the dots and see himself reflected, all amidst a Brooklyn that is forever changing. And I like how amorphous the history feels on this album, especially as we cling to what might seem like absurd constants through faltering technology. Listening to this alongside Ka's newest album, it's fascinating, because where he feels he must ground himself in that New York history to center his values and speak truth to power, Uncommon NASA wants to dig into the crevices, question his own view of history, to only further center himself in his presence and in his own very complicated relationship to the systems in hip-hop culture, especially as both are older New York men who have seen their lanes become entrenched or neglected, and for NASA, someone who has no children and wonders the next questions of his own legacy, they're coming. So factor in some of the thematic layers and the sense of vivid detail that will always characterize Uncommon NASA's writing, paired with some of his most vibrant production and his most forceful delivery pretty much to date on a project that actually has hooks and solid pacing. Yeah, legit great. I easily can recommend this. 8 out of 10, it's been ignored by a lot of folks who I think would really like it. You should hear it. Next up from Injury Reserve, By the Time I Get to Phoenix.
And that's a tough pill to swallow, because I'm not getting tired of. Please, anyway I can go, please.
Well, this might be the worst possible time to start talking about Injury Reserve. Look, I know, I'm late to the party, really late. I knew about the Arizona group's critical acclaim, I just never got around to talking about them, really hearing their catalog, and now that I have, yeah, the early stuff is stuff full of swaggering bangers. Floss in particular, fantastic project. Then came 2019's self-titled that sacrificed a lot of the groove for glitch hop and jagged experimentation where the hooks didn't have anything close to the same punch. I didn't dislike like it, wasn't really gripped though. And then came the passing of Stepa J. Groggs, one of the lead MCs of this group. So even going into this album, I kinda had the uncomfortable feeling of walking in on a tragedy of which I was only now briefly aware. I understood that he had provided some vocals already for the project. It didn't really feel posthumous, but I have covered a lot of projects in this lane where the loss of a major voice can leave a void that you can't quite fill on record, so I did have some adjusted expectations. And thus with that, I'm sorry folks, it didn't click for me. And again, it's awkward for me to say that when I'm so late to injury reserve and the context in which this album exists. I'm fully aware that longtime fans will likely be way more invested in the impressively bleak, downbeat arc of the album and will have bought into the shuddering glitch of the experimentation. Stuff full of creaking samples spanning The Fall to Black Country New Road to Brian Eno, all serving to create the haunted but deeply chaotic and unstable vibe. And they've also probably bought into the increasingly warped vocals that are chopped into jagged fragments with the fidelity shifting wildly, where the lyricism is much more guttural and stripped down, but that's part of the point, to drive towards that implacable darkness in which they can't really see an escape. Now, I do appreciate that some of the context is established in a world dominated by a rush of engineered copycats in the industry, algorithms, and larger systems that you can't fully comprehend or understand. It can make sense to feel powerless or doomed, although tying that into 5G with all the attendant internet conspiracy theories, kinda dicey, even if it's likely more reflective of how people will go to conspiracy theories over trying to understand the larger system, and even then I think they might be kind of mocking it. It's tough to tell. And I do like how some of it is just factored into the natural passage of time, the loss of innocence in facing a broader world, where the splatter painting, lack of focus, and momentum kind of makes sense in context. But the execution just doesn't move me. Yeah, there's some cool sampling, some of the synth integration's really nifty, but the patchwork instrumentals and the production don't so much build an atmosphere of claustrophobia and depression, so much as the shambling, numb skeleton of it that doesn't really feel all that implacable or imposing or all-encompassing at all. And the contorted vocal mixing, the abuse of effects, the stripped-down writing, even putting aside comparisons to Floss, the writing feels bereft of detail and deeper insight beyond painting the atmosphere. It gives the feel of struggling to form the idea rather than fully delivering it. Even Death Grips at their most abstract, they were more visceral and tuneful than this. Kind of a shame because it feels like the ending of this album is really strong with Knees and By Storm, but it feels like the payoff to an album we didn't really get because it didn't land that initial punch for me. And thus, light 6 out of 10. I do recommend it because this brand of experimental music will resonate for a lot of audiences. I get that. I just wish I liked it more. And while we're in this territory, from Little Simz, Sometimes I Might Be Introvert.
Church, I see sinners in the church. Sometimes I might be introvert. There's a war inside. I hear battle cries. Mothers burying sons. Young boys playing with guns. The devil's a liar. Fulfill your wildest desires.
After Gray Area, I shouldn't have been all that surprised just how much anticipation was coming for Little Simz' next project. But the tidal wave of critical acclaim, that was shocking, especially with so many folks calling this the best album of 2021, once again almost entirely produced by Inflow of Salt, but promising a much lusher, jazz and soul inflected and classically robust palette. And clocking over an hour, this was Little Simz dropping the sort of huge sounding orchestral album statement that'll win over audiences and some critics on the color and bombast alone, the sort of classy, respectable acclaim that Rhapsody got with a project like Layla's Wisdom. Shame that it's nowhere near as interesting. And look, I want to preface all this by saying this is not a bad album by any means, and it does start off really strong. The strings, the horns, the percussion, they sound incredibly organic with some great texture. Lil Simz is the sort of conscious jazz rap performer who can actually embrace a softer palette while also spitting with a great command of groove. The very cultured interludes juxtaposing her with actress Emma Corrin, I actually really like, and I kind of wish a little more was made out of the culture clash with British high society. And you know what? There are seeds of interesting ideas about her finding peaceful composure within herself at odds with her own ego, warring complicated emotions about family that never quite resolve, and a lot of broader aspirations towards black excellence in UK culture. But the more listens I gave to this project, the more its grand expanse kind of feels undercooked. unable to pay off its swings at high drama. Not really a revolutionary album, nor does it seem like it's really trying to be, so you're focusing on Lil Simz's introversion and realizing that a lot of the affirmations she writes don't seem to add up beyond some very broad empowerment. I've seen a lot of her lyrics on this project being described as journaling, and I think it's a valid assessment. They're probably doing a lot of work for her, but I feel like the snapshots we receive without a little bit more detail and insight can't support such production that's implying that this is way more. I'm also reminded of a lot of my issues with Salt, in that this is an album that is tasteful to a fault, destined to wind up on one of Obama's playlists, and once you become accustomed to the vibe, it's gonna throw zero curveballs or surprises in the instrumentation or content. And no, it doesn't have to, but it's kind of a real shame when you know that Lil Simz can be way more of a lyrical bruiser, and she can take more risks than she does here. Going back to Rhapsody, this honestly reminds me a lot of her album Eve from 2019, where after a critically beloved breakthrough, she aimed to approach more lush, expansive, higher concepts, and while this will probably have a lot more emotional resonance to its target audience, it doesn't really expand beyond it if you want to go even a little bit deeper. And thus for me, when you couple it with a lack of tightness, momentum, and some production quibbles left over from Gray Area, where patches feel buzzed out and a lot blockier than they should, which is all the more distracting when the production sounds this lush and classically inspired. Yeah, 7 out of 10. I get how in 2021 we've been scrabbling for the event album, and this certainly aspires to it, and I do generally like it, but I don't love it, gotta say. Next up from Baby Keem, the Melodic Blue.
Memories about people all in my head. First come to mind is my mama buying me Jordans. Are we really made equal? Cause everybody got plans.
Alright, look, on some level I think I get Baby Keem. Nabbing the family cosign from Kendrick Lamar, he's a creative and slightly sillier figure, balancing the edges of sharper lyricism with melodic trap, where the memes are telling at least part of the story. So even if he's not really my thing, and to be clear, having heard all of his previous projects and the lead-off singles, he's not really there just yet, I think I understood the baseline appeal of this going in. And you know, I think some of that appeal does come through, but the more listens I gave this album, the more I was just convinced not only that if he didn't have Kendrick's cosign, his audience would be considerably smaller, but also how said cosign might have set up expectations that Baby Keem is just not ready to meet just yet. Now granted, I'm not sure the album does him a lot of favors with that. It is the feel of a sprawling, major label rap release with some pretty expensive sounding production and Kanye West drum samples and multiple beat switches in a couple of these songs, pushing the runtime past 50 minutes, and to put it bluntly, Baby Keem as a writer and as a performer is just not interesting nor consistent enough to sustain it. Yeah, his yelpy, bouncy style of rap can lead to some mimetic moments, and there's a couple patches of auto-tune crooning that I actually think mostly work, but dig even a little bit deeper into his content and you realize outside of some of those clever patches or just moments of batshit going for the meme, he's close to the exact same warping balance of flexing, fucking, and angst that's all over mainstream trap right now, and doesn't reflect a lot more depth or introspection. And that can get kind of exasperating when he starts to point fingers at the larger field for not experimenting or doing more to differentiate themselves when, come on, look in the mirror. Now, sure, Baby Keem doesn't need to be all that deep. He's most memorable at his most out there moments and silly, like on cuts like Vent. I sure as hell would not take this all that seriously, but that's where the bloat, the failed experiments, or just the outright derivative concessions serve to kill a lot of the momentum of this project and makes it feel a fair bit less fun than it can be. And all that's juxtaposed with the moments on songs like Issues and Scars, where Baby Keem is trying to be a fair bit more serious, talking about his mom's alcoholism and a broken home growing up, which does add a little bit of weight to his come-up story and try not to repeat the same mistakes going forward. But I have to say, the album is so sloppily sequenced that these moments rarely land the dramatic payoff that they really could. And that's not even cutting into the relationship songs on the album that frankly didn't land at all for me. So as it is, it's got glimpses of promise, but it's undercooked and not well structured to pay it off. Very light 6 out of 10. Take it or leave it. And finally, from Lil Nas X, MONTERO.
If I pop up, I'ma want it, but I get by. Tell the devil I can have a missile.
So, before some of you throw a hissy fit that I'm including this in an all-hip-hop episode, from the he's not a real rapper crowd to every bad faith extrapolation of that, I really don't want to get into a stupid argument about genre that Lil Nas X is looking to transcend every step of the way. Genre is marketing, even as he has hip-hop features, cadences, and production, and besides, if he can be mercenary in his marketing, promo, and clickbait, I'm happy to return the favor. At least I can be timely covering this. And thus with MONTERO. You know, it's odd just how much the singles feel very emblematic of his sound, especially in the overcompressed but technicolor trap instrumentals. The vocal pickups in particular, which juxtapose against the flashy horns and the synths, they always leave me feeling that this sounds a bit rougher and cheaper than it really should, even if again he's remarkably catchy. Maybe it's an issue with Take a Day Trip, who produced the majority of this album, and it's not quite as noticeable when they aren't on this track, but this is also an album that's got over a dozen mixing and mastering engineers, which doesn't really help any feeling of consistency song to song. Now granted, it's also not a pure trap album. Chunks of this project are trying to go for a more ramshackle, guitar-backed pop rock sound, a little bit similar to Post Malone's circa 2019, although his angst feels way more credible, we'll come back to that, but also occasionally remind me way too much of Travis Barker's percussion-driven Focus, where the groove can be extremely hit and miss. Probably the best case being That's What I Want, which I also think might be my favorite song on the entire album. So yes, unsurprising to everybody, it's kind of messy, but Lil Nas X often makes it a really damn catchy form of mess. And that takes us to the content, split in between a triumphant, flashy come-up narrative, where the album often serves as his own coronation, and the more melancholic moments, where you can tell that Lil Nas X is still a young gay man trying to explore his sexual desires and his adolescent alienation in some very vivid detail. Now, I don't want to say that the bragging and the pop decadence is a put-on, though, because it feels kind of authentic to Lil Nas X's wild and provocative streak and his own creative impulses, but you can also tell that the whole scene is doing a lot of work internally for him, laying claim to a lot of his own myth-making where the near-suicidal angst is gonna drag him back. Kind of reminds me a lot of early Kesha, and I mean that as a compliment. I also think it's worth noting this probably has the most male gay sex acts described in a mainstream album. I mean, props. But I'd also say, as someone who has listened to a lot of queer and sexually explicit music outside of the mainstream, the intended transgressive elements didn't hit for me as hard. I mean, an act like Perfume Genius feels way more visceral, even in a pop context. And like with Seven, I feel like Lil Nas X could afford to deepen and flesh out more of these songs and still remain quite pop. He's great at courting virality, and nearly all his guest stars are game for it, except for Elton John, weirdly enough, who only contributes the piano and no vocals. But some of the abbreviated track lengths leaves me wishing there was a little more to this. And as much as he wants his music to last, certain moments feel a little bit more slapdash, as if it was intended for pop disposability, and it doesn't have to be. If anything, it feels like a beachhead moment for a pop star laying claim to a unique identity, both in hip-hop and pop and everything in between, and proving that, beyond a doubt, he's not just a blip on the radar. I just wish there was a little bit more meat on that bone. And before the double entendres completely get away from me, yeah, 7 out of 10. Pretty damn good. You've probably heard it already, but if you haven't, check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I said some things that are undoubtedly contentious here. Please just be civil, have fun in the comments down below, and the scores are really my own personal demarcation. Do not take them that seriously, for God's sakes. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. We're getting back to the rest of the genres in my schedule, so if you want to get involved with that, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated to get involved in that, because again, it's got access to my schedule and my Discord, but if you want to, options available. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.